anything and anyone who stood in his way. The New York Times is now reporting that Trump aides had drafted an order to invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy the U.S. military to Washington, D.C. From that Times reporting, quote, Mr. Trump, enraged by the demonstrations, had told the Attorney General Bill Barr, the Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, that he wanted thousands of active duty troops on the streets of the nation's capital. Trump was talked out of the plan by the three officials. And the Wall Street Journal's Michael Bender reports in his new book that Trump wanted to put General Milley, now a target of a coordinated right-wing smear campaign over his comments about race, in charge of what could have been a brutal and violent campaign to suppress the protests. Milley firmly pushed back in what quickly became a shouting match in the Situation Room. That's according to an excerpt of Bender's new book obtained by Axios. It goes like this, quote, I said, you're in effing charge, Trump shouted at him. Quote, well, I'm not in charge, Milley yelled back. Quote, you can't effing talk to me like that, Trump said. God damn it, Milley said to others. There's a room full of lawyers here. Will someone inform him of my legal responsibilities? He's right, Mr. President, Bill Barr said. The general is right. Joining our conversation is Paul Rieckhoff, host of the Independent Americans podcast, president of Righteous Media, and founder of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And Mike Schmitz here, a New York Times Washington correspondent and MSNBC national security contributor, whose byline is on that New York Times reporting we started with about a draft of the Insurrection Act being prepared. Tell us more about that, Mike Schmidt.
Well, the president was very serious about this, and I think that's what we were trying to show in our reporting, is that this is something that the president talked about openly, and he talked about it so much that his aides thought that he may want to do it, and he may argue that he needs to do it, and they wanted to have that document ready for him. On a broader level, it sort of shows us something that we've come to learn and know, but that is that Trump's first instincts are towards grabbing as much power as possible, grabbing as much of the military to use as possible when he faces sort of a domestic problem. When he faced problems politically, he often reached for the Justice Department. Here he was facing a problem with protests, and he was reaching for the military. And it follows that pattern in behavior, something that we see up through and after the election, when there's discussions in the Oval Office about martial law, and there were concerns about the president using the Insurrection Act around the election and such. So indicative of the president's larger behavior over 4 years of trying to grab the arms of government and using it for his own politicalness, and showing the severity and serious nature of what the president was considering.
And Paul Rieckhoff, I mean, to Mike's point, it's about not just the pushing out of military power, but the pulling back of it as well. I mean, you look at one of the central questions that a 9/11 style commission to look at January 6th would answer, and most people want to know why the National Guard wasn't deployed more quickly. So it's not just an eagerness to use the United States active duty military troops on the streets of American cities, in this case, to quash protests. It's holding questions now about whether he held them back on January 6th. How do we get to the bottom of all of these questions and future-proof the presidency?
Well, I think it starts with a full investigation of what happened on January 6th, but way prior to that as well. I mean, a year ago right now, I was covering this. Many other folks were trying to sound the alarm because Trump had gutted the senior leadership at the Pentagon. He had driven out the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. He had replaced all the senior leadership with his cronies. And we were all praying that the guardrail would be Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley. It seems now that the reporting is proving that General Milley was that guardrail for democracy, for the military, for what could have been much greater violence, and definitely an unprecedented use of our military against American peaceful protesters. So Mark Milley has become, I said this on your show last week, like the new General Fauci. I think reporting over time is going to confirm that he fought inside to try to keep Americans safe, and he tried to protect the military. And now Fox News, the right-wing attack machine, extreme GOP elected officials have now made Mark Milley the new Dr. Fauci. He has crossed Donald Trump, and they're going to make him pay. This is payback for crossing Donald Trump out in the open, and they're going to make an example of him. And at the end, our military is going to suffer. We are right now at war with Syria. We're firing artillery into Syria, launching rocket strikes, and people are attacking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I can't underscore how damaging that is for our national security, for the morale of our military, and for our fighting men and women overseas.
You know, Mike, Paul raises an interesting point. I mean, you've written a lot about people who tried to hold the president back, either to protect him from himself politically or to protect the country. Where does Mark Milley, General Milley, fit in that with these pieces that we're learning from your reporting, from Mike Bender's book?
Well, I think, you know, there are these moments that we see where he was working to try and contain the president, to try and educate the president about the severity of using something like the Insurrection Act, trying to throw up roadblocks to stop him from doing that. And, you know, working with, you know, the other folks like Bill Barr and such in this moment to stop the president from using the Insurrection Act. But at the same time, you know, with Milley, it can be a mixed picture, because the image of Milley in military fatigues walking through Lafayette Park outside of the White House as it's being cleared, if the president goes for a photo op, is something that is seared in American history. This was a very tumultuous time. There was enormous amount going on in the country. There was, at the very least, the perception that the park was being cleared so the president could go for a photo op. And the president's top military advisor not wearing the uniform that he uses in the footage you were showing of him testifying before Congress, but wearing his military fatigues, the same thing that troops on the battlefield use, when they're out fighting war, is walking with the president, accompanying him as this park has just been cleared to essentially, for a personal political reason. And that is something that I'm pretty sure that he understands the severity of. And, he's spoken about that publicly, but it is a very, very important moment in last summer and in what leads up to the election.
Paul, it's an important point, because Bill Barr and others that are in this reporting, Esper, I mean, they all are now emerging in this body of reporting about, I'll put it under the category of how bad he really was, the ex-president. But there are plenty of examples, as Mike's saying, where they went along with it. And I think a lot of people made the point that Milley looks like he's in Fallujah, not in an American city where people have the right to protest. Let me play you what Donald Trump said to governors. I mean, it's pretty clear what Donald Trump wanted the protesters to be met with from the military or law enforcement. This is from a call with governors at the time.
You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run over you. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate. And you have to arrest people, and you have to try people. And they have to go to jail for long periods of time.
Paul, I think Mike Bender's book is also allegedly reports that he wanted protesters shot. And they weren't shot to kill, shot to maim, I believe, was what he told people to do. How do you kind of walk that back? I mean, you talked about what Fox News is sort of trying to pull apart the military along these ugly cultural and racial lines does. How do you put back the way the commander-in-chief wanted them to function in American society and on American streets when people were protesting?
It's very difficult. I was critical of Trump throughout his time in office and before, because he politicized the military at a level we've never seen before. He continued to rope them into politics. Stuff that used to be off limits became fair game for Donald Trump. And I've called him President Mayhem, because his mayhem spread across the entire country, and especially across our foreign policy and our national security apparatus and the Pentagon. So I think we're going to hear over the next few years, some folks are going to be on an image rehab tour, but other folks maybe stayed inside and held the line and tried to keep him contained. He was like a drunken, reckless abuser trying to get into the gun closet. I mean, the Pentagon is America's gun closet, right? And we have to remember, I used to sound the alarm all the time and remind people, he has access to nukes. If you didn't lose sleep at night and you kind of rested on your laurels, remember that Donald Trump had access to our nukes, but he also had access to our National Guard and many other forces that he could deploy against the American people. And I think that's part of his legacy. This was more dangerous, in my opinion, than even sending us into Iraq or sending us into Afghanistan. The hardest thing you can ask a young 19-year-old man or woman in uniform to do is to stand across peaceful American civilians and potentially command them to open fire. That is unprecedented. That is the single most dangerous thing you can do for our military and for our democracy that is dependent upon that all-volunteer force and the trust that's bestowed upon them.
Paul, should there be a focused commission to look at all of the orders given by the last commander-in-chief to the military?
Sure. I'm for as many investigations as we can have. I mean, in the military, we do an after-action review after every training mission, after every combat operation. We look through everything and say, what went well, what went poorly, what can we do differently? That's what a good military does. That's what a good democracy does. So I think pour sunshine on all of it. We should have more hearings, more transparency, and more focus, because this does impact real-time operations. I mean, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs have to deal with all this nonsense instead of dealing with getting our troops safely out of Afghanistan and dealing with rockets coming in from Syria. We can't do everything at the same time. And when the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs has to get marred up in all this domestic politics, it takes his eye off the ball. And our enemies are celebrating. Putin loves this. Kim Jong-un loves this. Our enemies love this. And that's the real danger of what we're experiencing right now.
Paul is sticking around for more. Mike Schmidt, thank you for joining us on your reporting. When we come back, congressional Republicans and conservative pundits have spent the last week, as we've been discussing, railing against a woke military. We'll ask Paul if the men and women on the front lines should actually be taught more about race and racism in our nation's history. That conversation's next.